I am going to, first of all, remind everybody that the reason I am doing this talk at this time is because it is very close to Persian New Year, and it's spring, first day of spring on the 21st of March. So it's a really very lovely time of the year. And today we've had our first day of spring. But because I've mentioned Iranian New Year, and there is a picture of our Iranian New Year table that we set up every year, it's very, very close to the principles of Zoroastrianism. And at some point, I will perhaps be able to explain the symbolism of what we put on our table. We call it the Hafshin or Hafsini or Hafchin, the 7 things that are put out to remind us of our closeness to nature and the fact that spring brings us new light and new life and renewal. And that's where spring cleaning comes from. We have 5 days before the New Year starts in Zoroastrian tradition to remember the dead and prepare for the new year, and to clean up our house, and to clean up our lives, and to feel like a New Year's resolution to refresh ourselves and go forward with good environmental intentions by looking at the beauty of our New Year table. So I could come back to
Shahin, forgive me, I forgot to say to everybody that we routinely record these lectures for future use and future distribution. If you don't want your picture put on there, please feel free just to close your video. Forgive me, Shahin.
That's fine. Okay. So I just wanted, and having mentioned Persian New Year and Iran, of course, this is a particularly poignant time for me to be doing this talk. We didn't anticipate when the date was set that the events would be such as they are in Iran. And so my heart goes out to everybody in Iran who's not going to be celebrating with joy the new year that they are about to come to on the 20th, the equinox, the 20th of March. So that I have to say, because it's truly the case that every day we are suffering here on behalf of our co-religionists and compatriots in Iran. Now, I'm going to move on to some basic facts and figures first, because I think that I can't really explain the philosophy that I want to talk about. Is it a lifetime philosophy or philosophy of life, or is it a ritualistic religion, until I've told you some basic things. And I know that many of you might have heard of Zoroastrianism because people have called us fire worshippers. They've called us worshippers of 2 gods. We've been called heathens and infidels. We might be known for having vultures, and we might also be known for having a very elaborate purity and pollution habits and customs. But actually, on the other hand, some of you might have heard, as Stephen said, the 3 wise men, who were 3 Zoroastrian priests. The Magi comes from the Iranian word for a priest, Moch. And you might have heard of Freddie Mercury, who was also a Zoroastrian, Parsi. And you might also know, or maybe you don't know, that the 3 first non-white MPs in British Parliament were also Zoroastrian, which is an amazing fact, considering how few we are. And just to give you an idea of how few we are in the world, once a very, very prominent world religion that has influenced Christianity and Judaism, according to scholars who've done research on it, we are now perhaps maximum 120,000 in the whole world, and diminishing for various reasons that today I won't go into, but political and also social. Now, just a quick background. As you heard, I've got a background. My grandfather was a priest, my maternal grandfather, and my background is teaching ancient history A-level, Greek and Roman history, which brought me into contact with Persian history because the Persians fought the Greeks and the Romans. And also my background in anthropology, where, having realized what an interesting and diminishing culture I come from, I decided that at least I could do some recording of what we know and what we have before it is literally wiped off the face of the earth. Now, I'll go on to talk a little bit about history. Do forgive me if some of you know all this. I'll try to go through some basic information. I don't want to gabble. I don't want to go too fast, but there's quite a lot I need to get through. And Stephen, I don't know if you're going to be the clock man, the clock master, but please give me a kind of 10-minute kind of...
My watch goes very slowly for you, Shahin.
If you'd like to have that done. But on my end, I cannot arrange a tour. I can only make a room reservation, which you already have in the Regency. Right. So I would recommend having that arranged at the front desk. Yeah.
So which number do I ring for the hotel?
Excuse me.
Yeah, could you, Ramesh, could you please mute yourself?
Right. We were treated to another conversation just then. Thank you. So I'm going to just tell us that this is a religion that is so ancient that it has passed through several phases in terms of language of the text, the sacred text that we have. We have the oldest phase, the Gartic phase. Then we have the younger Avestan phase that is equivalent to the time of the Achaemenids, when we had Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great who came to Marathon. Then we have the later phase, the Middle Persian Pahlavi phase of the Sasanians. And then we have the post-Islamic New Persian phase. So all of these are different phases of language and cult civilizations within Iran. And this is very much a religion that is rooted in the greater Iran that covers Iran, Afghanistan, Kurdistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. It's a very, very wide swathe of what was the Iranian plateau and the Iranian cultural area. Now, given that it's got so many phases and so many different languages that are associated with Zoroastrian texts, you add into the mix the survival of the pre-Zoroastrian religion, which there are references to in the text that I'm going to be talking about, the Gathas. I mentioned one of the languages is called Gartic, because it is the language of the poems of the sacred texts. And in the Gathas that I'm going to be talking about, you have quite a lot of information about pre-existing Zoroastrian religion that was a demonology type of religion, that we get references to people who follow of diva worshippers, demon worshippers. And so, there's all these different influences that will have probably given us some, would have kind of made their way into the different versions, and depending on what period of Zoroastrianism you're looking at. Now, I mention that because if you think of Christianity, you think of Christians and what Jesus was offering in terms of his ideas and philosophy and concept of life 2,000 years ago, approximately. And then you look at Christianity under the middle-aged Pope or today's Pope. You look at the Inquisition, you look at the Christian missionaries within the colonial period. Where are we going to look at for the original philosophy of Jesus? Similarly, we have the same question: where are we going to find the original philosophy of Zoroastrianism? At different phases, you have different styles or different developments and different people influencing. So I just put that into the mix for you to think about, because Zoroastrianism has gone through different phases, and some people will have picked up their information based on a very late form of Zoroastrianism. So the question is, where do we go to look for the original Zoroastrianism? We know that we had literacy really back as far as at least the Achaemenid times. I mentioned Cyrus the Great. Well, in the British Museum, we have the Cyrus cylinder, which is described with cuneiform. And we also have in Persepolis, the palace of the Achaemenid kings, we have tablets that have been found, they're cuneiform tablets on ceramic. And we also have silver tablets, which Darius put into the foundation corners of the palace. So we had literacy, and from those texts, we understand some of the influences that those kings were picked up on from the Gartic messages that are older than the period that I had mentioned, the Achaemenid times. But the point is, we were known to have a literate culture. And of course, going on later on, we've got the Sasanian period with Middle Pahlavi. Very many more texts have survived from that period. But we had at that point almost a reinvented religion, because although we had literacy and texts, and we believe we had a library in Persepolis, it is said that Alexander, and in Persia they call him the accursed, not the great, Alexander of Macedon, burnt the library. And so many of our original texts disappeared and had to be recollected with the next very important and influential dynasty that Iran experienced. We had the Parthian dynasty. We don't know too much about the Parthians. We know that they fought the Romans, and sometimes they won and sometimes they lost. But we know from the Sasanian period that Zoroastrianism was really reinvented. They brought together as many surviving texts and books from wherever they could. And that also included some of the older, we believe, texts that would have come from the pre-existing, they weren't written then, but they were orally transmitted and recollected and put down into written form under the Sasanian dynasty, which lasted about 400 years in Iran, from the 3rd century Christian era or Common Era, post up to the Arab invasion in the 7th century Common Era. So it's quite difficult to say, well, what's the Zoroastrianism that you are going to know about? Now, from my point of view, it makes sense to me not to look at the later version, which was the reinvented version, which really distorted what we find if we go to the oldest and by now accepted authentic source, which is the Gathas. And in fact, although we have the Gathas, even despite that, it wasn't available until quite recently, because the Gathas were very unknown. They were lost. They were buried in the center of the Zoroastrian corpus of prayer. And quite honestly, just as people were saying the Latin Mass until quite recently, in many countries, without understanding Latin, it was just a liturgy that they repeated and recited. Similarly, with these Zoroastrian prayers and sacred texts, some things were recited like parrots without understanding, just to preserve the tradition. And we're very fortunate that that happened. We have a discrepancy of ideas of what Zoroastrianism is, partly because of our community being divided into two. And I mentioned Freddie Mercury and the 3 British MPs. They were from the Zoroastrian branch called the Parsis. And the Parsis came from Persia, so there's a connection with the word Persia. But Persia was the province from which the main Sasanian and Achaemenid dynasties arose. So people called Iran Persia because that was where the seat of kingship was. And the Parsis left Iran because of the pressure that they experienced trying to practice their religion when the Arab conquest had settled in and took place. And it was quite a brutal experience for many people. And so they decided that they would go off and try their fortunes in India. So we have the Parsis story, and the Parsis left Iran according to the tradition of the Sanjan around 9th or 10th centuries, and they arrived in India and they were allowed to stay by the local ruler in Sanjan in the Gujarat, and they described themselves as people who would integrate. They'd be like sugar in milk. They would dissolve. They wouldn't be felt. They wouldn't overflow, like sugar would not overflow if it was dissolved in milk. And so they kept their customs very low key. They really didn't want to stick their heads above the parapet and cause any offense. And when they left Iran at the time, it was actually a capital offense to try and bring people back to Zoroastrianism when they had been, in many cases, forced by the sword. And we've seen something of what ISIS is able to do. Well, the Iranians experienced that. And of course, we know what Iran is experiencing today. It seems to attract a particularly brutal form of the version of Islam that was practiced there. And it's a historic matter. So when the Parsis left, they were very conscious they shouldn't convert people. They shouldn't, because it could be so dangerous. And arriving in India, they wanted to also be discreet and be accepted. So they kept certain ideas and practices that were not necessarily part of the teaching. It was part of the social conditions in which they lived. And when you look at other distinct communities, look at the different sorts of Buddhists we have in Tibet, Burma, Sri Lanka, Japan. It's not necessarily that everybody has a uniform idea of what Buddhism is in those countries, but there are some basic principles that unite these religions. And similarly with the Zoroastrians of India and Iran, some basic ethical principles that are core to the teachings of Zoroastrianism survived. And in India, I think Gandhi said something like, Parsi, thy name is charity. And that is part of the core teachings of being kind and doing good. And I will come and talk about that in a minute. So Iranians, on the whole, are taught very closely, much more closely to the Gathic philosophy, the Gathas being the verses that we believe are ascribed to Zoroaster. This is accepted now. It's a very difficult text. It's so ancient. The language is so difficult. People are still scholars, linguistic scholars are still arguing over what one word might mean or another word might mean. But nevertheless, there is overall consensus that the Gathas contain messages that are comprehensible, and they are ascribed to Zoroaster himself. And they're poetic in form. And that makes it particularly difficult. Imagine poetry from 3,300 years ago. That is the date at which we can identify the history of the Gathas and when they were composed, because comparative linguists have done work on this, and they have been able to find very close equivalents with Vedic Sanskrit, and that has helped them to identify a date. So while Stephen mentioned 600 BC, yes, that was the golden age of Iranian Zoroastrian, if you like, the kings and the reigns and the monarchs of that period were absolutely at their peak of Persian culture, we can say. But in fact, it goes back a long way earlier to 1,300 years BC. And we know that the Gathas consist of 17 chapters and 238 stanzas, smaller sections, and only 6,000 words. It's a very short document, and a lot of it is repetitive. But it is a very difficult thing to try and read. You have to be very determined to get to grips with it. But I have reread it many, many times, and I find a lot of interesting philosophy in there that I'm going to tell you about today. From the Gathas, we do get some information, biographical information about Zoroaster. We know that his father, he comes from a priestly family of that time. And we also have information about Zoroaster from legend and tradition, which is much later. But we know that from the Gathas, he had a daughter. He addresses his daughter and her husband. We know he had cousins. We know that the first king who followed him was called King Vishtasp or King Gustasp. So we have a few bits of biographical information, and we know that the time he lived in was very turbulent. And what I'm now going to talk about is how the Gathas, quickly I tell you about how the Gathas was preserved. It was preserved orally initially, when everything had been destroyed. The basic core teachings, when people didn't even understand the language, were passed on, repeated and recited by priests. And that was their main function in many cases. And Parsi priests still today do an awful lot of repeating and reciting without necessarily understanding, but they feel it their holy duty to pass down what has been preserved and passed down orally. And if it wasn't for the oral tradition, then there could be no written tradition that was reconstructed. And in the 18th century, a Frenchman called Anquetil du Perron, who was amongst the many people who traveled to Iran and India, and on their way either on a trade mission or in religious missions or out of curiosity and travel, came across Parsi texts in India and tracked down Parsi priests, and was able to work out an amazing discovery for him that the language, there were several layers of language in these texts, and amongst them, there was the language, the oldest language. And it was like an onion. I like this metaphor. Somebody gave this idea as an onion. The kernel of the onion is the oldest, most sacred part. And then around it are the later accretions, the later skins. And there are interpretations, more prayers added, more sacred texts added. But at the bottom, in the middle, you find the oldest core that's best preserved and looked after sacredly by all these different layers surrounding it. And working on these different layers of language, he was able to identify this ancient language, the Gathas. And people have been working on it ever since and still are. So now I am going to talk about the philosophy that you find in the Gathas, because in my opinion, that is where you get the core message of Zoroastrianism, the message that was embodied in the verses that ascribed to Zoroaster. I have to also tell you that I'm not going to give you chapter and verse here, because that just gets a bit too academic and too boring. But if anybody wants to have chapter and verse references on anything I say today, I'd be very happy to provide that to you. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the concept of Ahura Mazda. Some of you might have thought of Mazda lamps. When I was young, there was a factory that made Mazda lamps, and the lamp of light, and that was probably influenced by the idea of Ahura Mazda. The etymology of Ahura Mazda, the root meaning of Ahura Mazda, means the Lord of wisdom, the Lord of the mind. So first of all, we have the idea that Ahura Mazda is to do with the mind and wisdom and what's going on inside. It's connected with the word, the root of to think. And we have even got the word mania in English from that connection, this ancient Indo-European root. And there are epithets. Now, this is not God as the Abrahamic religions understand it. It is not God up in the heavens. That Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all have the concept of a kind of external God. This is not what Zoroastrianism understands by Ahura Mazda. It is a concept that is all in the mind. And there are references, very clear references in the Gathas to saying that this is a mental realization of what is happening, what is going on. It's our minds that have created God, if you like. It is because we have a mind and an ability to think that we're able to conceive of creation. And so what we have to try and do is to try and develop our minds. And so the Zoroastrian Gathic text is a lot of space given to imprecations to our minds to find the right way forward, to find the right path to conduct our lives. And finding the right way through developing our minds to find the right path is the basic message of the Gathas. Lots of imprecations then to Ahura Mazda, to our own minds, to find the right way forward. And the right way forward is called Asha. And it is connected with fire, connected with light. So we're looking to find the way to the path towards light and enlightenment. And it is not that different from the concept of looking at the Tao in Confucianism, to go on the right path to lead the correct sort of life. So that is very much a core message in the Gathas. And the next very important message is that we have two potential options. We have energies, the positive energy, which is beneficent. It is synonymous with truth and light. And we have the opposite of that, the negative energy that is maleficent, and it is equated with a lie and darkness. And the positive, I think, is very similar to the Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia, kind of good thinking, positive spirit. And we have, as human beings, a free choice. We choose what we want to follow. It is given a choice. We have that choice because we have the mind. And if we have the mind and we've developed our minds, then we can make the conscious choice between right and wrong. And in the Gathas, we read that one of the ways to develop clear thinking, which is vuhumana, that's again mana, the idea of thinking, and we have, as I mentioned, we have English words from that root. We have clear thinking, which is today, there's a Persian word bahman that comes from vuhumana, and it is through meditation and silent consideration and contemplation of nature. So those are some of the messages about how we can develop our minds to be able to make the right conscious choice that we can make freely. And other qualities that we need for conscious choice are strength, determination, love, humility, and listening to our conscience. So these are all concepts we find in the Gathas. And one of the practical ways to achieve Asha, to get onto the right path, to get towards light and enlightenment, is to bring happiness to other people through good deeds. And there's a mantra. The Zoroastrians are known for good thoughts, good work, and good deeds. So if anybody hears the Zoroastrians being described as people who do good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, that's a shortcut. Good words, good thoughts, good deeds. Well, you start with thoughts, of course. So it's good thoughts and good words and good deeds. And then that is where we say that if you are on the right path to Asha, then you achieve it by bringing happiness to others. And that happiness that you bring to others brings happiness to you. And after all, we don't know what's happening after life. People can talk about it. We don't know. We only surmise. We only think through our minds what might be awaiting us. So the important thing is to make the best of this life on this earth while we are alive now, and to be fully fulfilled, to be happy. We achieve it by bringing happiness to other people. So those are some of the very, very important basic principles, the ethics of Zoroastrianism. But there are many other things that we find there in the Gathas. We find a very direct address to men and women. This message that Zoroaster is trying to communicate is to men and women. And indeed, he talks to men and women directly several times and says we have to work together. We are hamsar, means we're equal heads. We are spouses together, working together to try and achieve a better world while we are here through our good deeds together. And also, I have to say that there is a very sweet message in the Gathas at the end towards his daughter and her newlywed husband. And he says, try each of you to surpass the other in your good deeds and find time to love each other. So it's a really very strong message about love. There's a lot of love in this message from Zoroaster, trying to be kind, trying to be good, loving each other. And then he goes on to mention that there are people who are poor and needy. They're vulnerable from abuse, and they're vulnerable from exploitation by powerful people and rich people. So there's several messages there that although you may be poor, you do not in any way have any lesser standing or lesser ability to achieve good. And in fact, very often it is the rich and the powerful who actually exercise those maleficent energies that were addressed or mentioned at the beginning. And he does talk several times, several criticisms of powerful, manipulative rulers and priests he called demon worshippers, who are misleading the populations and putting them in fear. And he also talks about, he expresses his horror and desperation at the conditions of the society around which in which he's living. He talks about plunder, rape, aggression, and anger. And of course, when we talk about the exploitation of powerful and rich people over the poor, or the people who are disarmed and vulnerable, and society being open to aggression and anger, he then goes on to say that there is a need for just people, wise leaders to rule, to protect, and to bring peace to the home, the village, the town, and the country. Now, bear in mind that this is all being said 3,300 years ago, and it is actually still addressing the needs of today's world as well. And so when I talk about the Gathas, I'm always very amazed by how revolutionary it is in many ways, how apt it is for the world that we live in today. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have to think about Iran, and many of the issues that are raised here apply very pertinently. Now, another aspect of Zoroastrianism, which I did mention briefly, was the need to meditate and have an experience of silence and to contemplate the beauty and the miracle of the natural world and the need to protect it. So in the Gathas, there is a lament. There is an almost, as I mentioned, it's a poem. There was a poetic form. There are several different aspects to it. There's a metrical rhythm to it. And there is also, there are metaphors in it, and there's actually a little section. This is almost like a drama. It is Zoroaster talking and having an internal conversation with Ahura Mazda. He's asking for direction and guidance. So there are different styles of poetry or poetic form in the Gathas. And at this point, when he is talking about the natural world, he puts it through the voice of Mother Earth, lamenting the fact that she is unprotected and she's being abused. And then, as I mentioned, there is encouragement, men and women are addressed, and there is at one point, several points in the Gathas, an encouragement that men and women should share this message with others who might want to join the community of well-minded people. So very clearly, this is not a message that is only for the people of a certain race or a certain caste. It is a message for everybody who shares these values and who wants to join together to jointly increase the store of goodness that is in the world around them, in the community. And there is also Zoroaster's expression of hope many times that this community that's starting very small with his own family, but luckily he has a king called Kavi Vishtas on board, they can overcome the naysayers, those who wish them evil and wish to continue their own power, despite the fact that they're causing such tumultuous events around them. And then after all of this discussion about how am I going to achieve this? Who is going to listen to me? How do I overcome the people who are trying to put this message, or suppress this message of kindness and goodness, helping the poor and helping the needy? He talks about the rewards. And he says the rewards for choosing the life which brings harmony and brings happiness is indeed happiness and seeing the light through enlightenment. So if you are on the right path of Asha, which is the path of light, and it's equated with fire, and the path of righteous harmony and order, then you will eventually experience that happiness and There's also brief discussion, brief mention of the end of life. There is a bridge of judgment, and that bridge of judgment is certainly not an unknown concept in Christianity. And it is said in the Gathas that those with good deeds to their credit will reach the abode of song and light. And that is all we know about what awaits us once we have given up this mortal coil. And there is one...
10 minutes, please, Shahin.
10 minutes left.
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, that's the state that, and those who have been unkind and unjust will fall into the abode of the lie and remain there forever. So I would like to simply mention that those are the distillations of the contents of the Gathas. And for me, there is very clearly direction and a philosophy of life that I can find relevant to today. But we also have a ritualistic side of things. And as I mentioned, we have different times and different periods of development. And for example, as I mentioned, in the Sasanian times when they had to reinvent the religion from whatever sources they had, they ended up losing the concept of the beneficent spirit opposed to the maleficent spirit, which are, if you like, abstract concepts. They're just constructs of what's going on when we have to make choices. And they ended up creating an opposition between Ahura Mazda, which is, if you like, the creative energy that gives forth all these thoughts and possibilities of construction, and Angra Mainyu, the negative spirit. So they've juxtaposed, or they've put into opposition and polarity, if you like, Ahura Mazda and the negative spirit. And that is actually not the true Zoroastrian idea. And then from all of those things and all these different distortions that came after, you have lots of different rituals. The power of the clergy grew enormously. Some say that it was so great, it led to such dogma that eventually things like 5 times a day prayers, having to be initiated, not accepting outsiders, priests reciting and having ritual implements that they shouldn't pollute, having certain rituals when they do their... Sometimes some of the prayers that the priests will conduct will last up to 8 hours. Now, that is a very, very demanding ritual that people might find extremely demanding and tiring. And there's also purity laws that became very, very elaborate. And for example, my mother, even as the daughter of a priest back in the day, my mother is now, would be around 102 if she was alive now, well, she had to undergo a purity ritual, which involved all sorts of things that we wouldn't consider to be very Zoroastrian, because they're not prescribed in the Gathas, but they developed through the power of the priests and ritual time, just as there are many rituals in many other religions that have developed, with archbishops and power potentates and so on, telling us what we must do. Now, these rituals go as far as the last rites. Some people may or may not know that we have dogs in our last rites. We love dogs. Dogs are a really important part of our culture in ancient Iran, Zoroastrian Iran. And we think that dogs are so sensitive that they can pick up drugs, they can pick up cancers. And in the days when we didn't have electrical machines, they could tell us if somebody was dead or not. But there are people who believe that rather than dogs having a function, their function was, the dog was there to ward off evil spirits at point of death if they had 2 dots above their eyes. And so some communities of Parsis will bring in what they call a 4-eyed dog to ward off evil spirits, rather than thinking of the function of the dog, which was to determine death. Some people say that when we have our holy fire, which represents the energy of life and light and enlightenment, and I've explained, some people think that that shouldn't, for example, shouldn't be polluted by the use of regular wood. It should only be sandalwood. Some people say it shouldn't be using gas. But of course, we had natural gas fires in Azerbaijan. There's also differences in the calendar, because if people are separated by time and space over thousands of years, and they forget in some communities to add a leap year, then the calendar slips. And so there is confusion in different communities about the calendar. But the things that we do celebrate very strongly is the cycles of nature. We celebrate, as you heard at the very beginning, our beautiful spring new year, which happens at the time of the equinox, when night and day are equal, the days start getting longer, and spring truly springs when the birth of animals and the plant life and everything comes back to life. We celebrate the shortest day because it means that after that, light is coming back, and that's the midwinter solstice. We celebrate autumn festival, autumn equinox, Mergan, our harvest festival. We celebrate water, and we have a water festival in the middle of summer because in the plateau of Iran, anyway, water was very precious and very, very scarce. And so we enjoy water, but also revere it and respect it. And we also have a fire festival because without fire, we know that we would have no light, we would have no heat, we would have no cooking and no culture such as we have and all the things that fire can fashion. So my message is that, yes, we do keep some of our rituals. We mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater because we can understand what, if you like, has become ritual that's been maintained for its own sake without understanding it. And we also need to understand that these are historic. Some of our practices and our traditions are so ancient, so historic. It would be a shame to just lose them all. But there are certain things that have a meaning, they have a reason, and we need to understand it. For example, our pollution rituals and the whole concept of menstruation in many, many different religions and cultures has been discussed, has been addressed. And there were very good reasons why we had certain customs that address that matter. Today in the 21st century, it is almost irrelevant because we don't have those issues. There are social issues that were around that. And today we have managed to overcome some of the problems. And so it is a progressive philosophy that adapted the natural world. And today, in the 21st century, much of the ethical principles absolutely relevant to how we live today. So we can revere nature, we can respect nature, we don't pollute the elements. And we have to remember that this is a 3,300-year-old philosophy that has come through, and these elements have survived. The principles of telling the truth, being just, being fair, not cheating people, and trying to work towards a better society, looking after the vulnerable, thinking about the power that people have and how they use it. Darius, in his Persepolis tablets, talked about Ahura Mazda guiding him and hoping that he would be a just king for everybody. Cyrus the Great cylinder in the British Museum is not there because it's the writing, it's because of what he was saying in that cylinder. He was saying that he freed the Jews were kept in, he helped to rebuild their temple. So the idea of justice and fairness, even amongst rulers, goes back a very, very long way. So it is a philosophy of life, but there are ritualistic aspects to it which have got reasons. And if you understand where they come from and you go back to the core of why they were there, there is a rationale behind everything. Sadly, in some communities, at some period, these got obscured and lost and became themselves the dogma rather than understanding the reason behind it. And what today Iranian Zoroastrians have done is pare that all back. Today we have women priests. We had women priests going back into the 9th, 10th century. We have documents telling us about women priests. So we were there long before this Archbishop of Canterbury got there. But we, it was lost for a long, long time. And it's only now in the 20th century and 21st century that we have been able to reinstate women priests, indeed in Iran. Although the Parsis don't accept that yet, I suspect the time will come when they will as well. So there have been many differences over the space and time that separates us. But we are getting closer together again thanks to the diaspora that's been created. In this global society that we live in the 20th century or 21st century, Zoroastrians have been dispersed to 5 planets. It's a global presence now. They are found in Australia, America, Canada, South America. There are people who convert to Zoroastrianism today. The Parsis, again, haven't been very accepting of that because it was in their tradition that they shouldn't do it for, as I mentioned, good reasons when they left Iran. But in the free society that we live in today, and given the message that the Zoroaster says for anybody who shares the principles of wanting to create a better society with harmony and kindness, that is a philosophy open to people. It is not a closed door. And so we have, in our community in England, we have Spaniards, we have Germans, we have Polish people, we have, of course, many Iranians who've chosen to go back to the religion of their ancestors. And it is, I think, there that I will stop, because I hope I've demonstrated that it is indeed a philosophy of life. It is a very, very hard text to get into. But if you want to get into it, there are many different translations. I've used the translation. I'm going to just hold it up. I use this Gathas book. It's written by the brother of our last high priest. It's a Persian version. It's a bilingual text, Persian and English. And there are others. There's a very famous, recently deceased, well, 5 or 6 years deceased professor from Yale University, Stanley Insler, who was a very, very famous Sanskritist and Indo-European philologist. He did a very great work on the Gathas, and many, many others have worked on it. It's not an easy text, but if you can have the stamina to keep trying, you will find many, many gems. And as I said, the things that I've told you about that come from the Gathas, I can give you chapter and verse so you can look at it if you want to. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that, if I can answer them, if people have any. I am not going to say that I can always answer everything, but we can give it a go if you want to. I don't know whether this system and whether our talk allows questions and answers, Stephen.
It certainly does. Thank you ever so much, Shahin. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know from when you've spoken here that you could do the same thing 10 times over. There was so much to be said about Zoroastrianism, which is fascinating to me. Now, those of you familiar with Zoom will know how to use your hand, electronic hand. Those of you less familiar with Zoom will not. If you go to the bottom of your screen, below all the names and pictures of people, you will see React. If you click on that, it's a rather unruly looking heart. You will have one that says raise hand. Now, the reason I want you to raise hand that way rather than feebly gesticulating in my direction is two reasons. One is that some of you are on the second screen, but more than anything, the people whip to the left-hand side of the screen and I can see what order they came in and I don't miss anybody. So if even though Jane is about to ask a question, when you know you've got a question formulated, Dr. Field, I'm expecting something sensible from you. When you have a question formulated, if you just raise your electronic hand, because then you will line up at the top and I'll know whom to ask next. Talking of Dr. O'Hara.
Thank you very much for a very, well, I feel like I've been given a whistle-stop tour of Zoroastrianism, so I may have got some of the wrong concepts. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit more. I think you said that there wasn't the same concept of a transcendent God or essence of a being in the same way as there is in most other religions. And so I wondered, what is the concept of the soul? And you did say that there is an understanding that after life, if there's been a lot of positive thoughts and actions, there will be some kind of afterlife, which is a good one. So that sort of indicates that there might be some sort of soul or spirit which continues. And how then do you relate that to the idea that there's no actual God?
Well, we have only the Gathas to go on, and of course, people in later periods have elaborated and created ideas that may or may not have been influenced by. Don't forget that Zoroastrianism was in existence at the time of Christianity and carried on through the period of Christianity, and also in contact with other philosophies. But like many philosophies, and I mean, if you're talking about a pure philosophy, we don't necessarily have to know what comes after life. We simply have a concept that is like a metaphorical concept. We don't know. We know that we have an energy that is what gives us breath and gives us life. And the epithets for Ahura Mazda are the all-powerful, the creator of life and wisdom, the creator of existence. But it is a construct. The whole concept is that Ahura Mazda is a mental concept, mental construct, and we don't therefore really know and therefore it is not heavily elaborated in the Gathas. We have an energy, it is released at some point when we die. That's as much as we know, and we don't know where it goes, we don't know what happens, but it is almost as if it is giving us hope for a good, if you want to imagine a life beyond, and you have got somewhat of desire to believe in it, then it is certainly a comfort and a positive thing if you know that you will cross this bridge of judgment and your good deeds will get you to what has only been described as the house of song and the house of light. We know no more, and that is all that we can say. It's a very rational kind of philosophy. It is not based on superstition and the faith of something. It's based on what we know and what we can understand. So, and it is a problem for some people because people want to have a real elaboration of what comes next. And the honest truth is that we don't know what comes next. Now, the one thing that I haven't mentioned, but there is a Zoroastrian concept, is of this idea of renewal, that we have renewal every spring when the year comes round. We have also renewal in our lives. We have a chance to reconstruct ourselves. If we know that one day we come to the realization we have not been good people, we can reconstruct ourselves and become better people. So it's never too late. But it is also said that people who don't reconstruct themselves will end up falling into the land of the lie. And that's all we know, into kind of a darkness, a lie. But there is possibly the idea that one day they may emerge, but it's not developed. So I cannot tell you. Now, later Zoroastrianism has indeed developed these ideas. But, you know, I, who am perhaps a bit of a, what can I say, a pedant, want to go back to what I can say is truly the original Zoroastrianism, not what people have invented later on. So even though it may be an unsatisfactory answer, Jane, I'm afraid that is as far as I can tell you, because I'm being very honest and not making up a story that I cannot then give you chapter and verse to. So there we are. That's what I can tell you about. Now, and there is one, there is a mention of a saviour. A saviour, one, you know, could be the saviour who is going to come and bring people to the realization that society needs to be reconstructed towards good. But there is nothing more specific about who that saviour will be, when that saviour will come, and what that saviour will do. But there is the concept of hope. So that is, if you like, the function of the saviour, to give you hope.
Thank you.
Shahin, I have two questions. I'll ask them both together before you answer one, please. The first is a very simple one. I used to pride myself on the fact I had a copy of the Avesta, which I used to check up. I kind of get the feeling from you that the Zend Avesta is not such a good source as the Gathas. The second question is, some historians perhaps sloppily give reference to Zoroastrianism when they're talking about Manichaeanism and Catharism. Are you happy with that, or does that get on your nerves?
No, well, first of all, let me clarify Avesta. The Avesta is a term that is used to describe the corpus of sacred texts that Zoroastrians use. And the corpus of Zoroastrian texts is just made up, as I said, of this onion of different periods of sacred words. The Zand, the word you said, Zand Avesta, the Zand is a commentary in the language of the time when the people composed the commentary. So it's a commentary of, if you like, knowledgeable people trying to explain what the texts actually mean. And then they become ossified or crystallized, and then somebody else adds more to the corpus. So the Avesta is indeed the corpus of texts, and at the middle of the corpus of these texts is the Gathas. So the Gathas are part of the Avesta, and they are part of the oldest part, but around them and in between them there are younger bits of Avesta as well. So that's the first thing. So the Avesta is simply a description of commentary on the Avesta. And then the whole thing about Manichaeism and Gnosticism and Catharism, they are all clearly Mani was himself born within a Zoroastrian, if you like, environment. There was a part of the world, the sort of civilization that existed at the time. And so he had this idea, he had developed, he had received and inherited the very strong awareness of good and evil, but he developed it in his own way and created, if you like, his version of it. It's like some people would say a heresy, some people just say an individual, let's say the Mormons or the Methodists or the Baptists, each one has their own version of what the original ideas were in Christianity, but this one went off on his own limb and created his own sect. So Manichaeism was really very much born from some of the basic concepts of good and evil within Zoroastrianism. And I don't know much about Catharism, and I don't know too much about Gnosticism, but clearly with some of the very, very clear polar ideas of the ability to choose between good and evil, and there are two existing energies at work within the world that can pull you this way or that way, that polarization, positive spirit, negative spirit, sepentamenu, angramenu, and anybody who knows Persian, the word angramenu is given forth the word Ahriman, and Ahura later became Hormuz. And in fact, interestingly, we talk about the Straits of Hormuz these days. They've been talking about shipping lines. Hormuz is a derivation of Ahura Mazda. It's a first name in Persian, and it is actually from that. So that's just by the by. Just that this polarization of good and evil. And I mean, by the way, I think the Cathars were people who were known got to France, and they were the Albigensians in France, weren't they? They were kind of connected with the Albigensians.
Yes, yeah, they were the same people.
And the Albigensians in Iran, the Zoroastrians would call themselves Behdin, people of the good religion, and the Albigensians were called les bons chrétiens, the good Christians. So there is a kind of clearly some sort of influence, some sort of traditional continuity, but I don't know too much about the Albigensians were, except that they were trying, as I understand it, to go back to the original teachings of Jesus Christ. They were much more, if you like me, fundamentalists, going back to the basic teachings that they could glean from the teachings of Jesus. So, in as far as they were conscious of their mission to do good, I think that there was that similarity.
Thank you. Let's have some more questions, please. It's not every day you get an opportunity to not only talk to a Zoroastrian believer, but one who is also a scholar of the faith. Dr. Field.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'd like to know if there's any specific teaching about violence, given the term jihad, for example, is taken to involve violence. It shouldn't do, according to the strict meaning.
Well, I don't know if you heard me saying that from the Gathas, Zoroaster laments the fact that the society that he lives in is very turbulent and is surrounded, as he says, by, he talks about rape, outrage, anger, violence. And he says that this is the society that he lives in, and it's a totally turbulent and disturbing society. And he hopes and prays, effectively, that he can find the inner strength to teach against violence and against the exploitation of the vulnerable by the powerful and ruthless rulers. And he several times denounces people who are all powerful and who are exploiting their ability through either wealth or through the control through religion, or control through the kind of power that they have acquired, perhaps through their through violence, to control the lives of ordinary people. So there is very much, very closely, a very, very specific mention of what is upsetting society and what Zoroaster would like to see being put an end to through the supremacy of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Well, as I said, the thoughts come first, then the words, then the deeds, and this general movement towards kindness and acts of generosity that bring happiness to our fellow human beings. So there is a lot of mention of the violence that is seems to be abundant in the society that he was experiencing.
Thank you.
And certainly no jihad. There is no justification for taking any war anywhere to try and achieve one's end.
Thank you both. Paul.
Is that me? Hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the origins of Zoroaster. Was he known anything about the history of him, where he was born, how he came to his philosophy and...
Good question. I'm sorry, I didn't necessarily address it very directly. As I said, the Gathas gives us a few very sparse directions, but from the language of the Gathas, which is supposed to be an Eastern Iranian language, if you're looking at the kind of etymologies that you can compare it with, it is probably from an area that we might call today, some people would claim Eastern Iran, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. This was all part of Greater Iran. This was all part of the Iranian plateau and cultural zone where they spoke Iranian languages. And there were a number of them, rather like, Indo-European languages. And you kind of get to the Teutonic language and they split up into Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian and so on. So these were all part of the same mother group. So we know that the language is Eastern Iranian, so that would indicate a homeland in Eastern Iran. We have an indication from, again, tradition, although some of this tradition is legend, that he was killed in Balkh, which is in today Afghanistan, just on the borders of Uzbekistan. We know that he had a daughter, he had a wife, he had brothers and cousins. And the dating, as I think I told you, was about 1,300 BC, pretty much accepted now by linguistic scholars based on this linguistic analysis. How he came to it is the Gathas is kind of a living hallucination. It's almost like a vision. It's like a conversation with an internal mind. It's Zoroaster kind of having this insight, and it's a moment of kind of a light bulb moment that goes on, and he has this internal realization that these are the things that are happening. We are capable of making choices. We are capable of constructing things that are positive or negative. So it is a difficult thing to actually say how he came to it, but we think and we believe he was a youngish man. He was born of a priestly family, and he turned his back on that priestly system because he could see the damage it was doing to the people because they were being controlled by the priests. And so he turned his back on that and denounced them and said, this is, the way that society is being run by powerful people is unfair. But we don't know much more detail, and there's no point in inventing it. And in fact, people did invent it. Legend would have it. People have invented stories about all sorts of important people. And so around Zoroaster, later on, there were legends. There's a very famous Persian epic poem, the great kind of equivalent of the Odyssey or the Iliad, the Homer of our times, the Shahnameh, much later. It's about from about the 10th century, but it talks about the stories of ancient Iran, and there is an enormous preface to the Shahnameh that even many Iranians don't read. And the preface was probably written by the man before Ferdowsi, who wrote the Shahnameh. Daghiri was the original composer, and it is thought he was a Zoroastrian, and he does give some insights, a little, into the background of Zoroastrianism. But apart from that, we have a much later document called the Zartushnameh, which is a hagiography, but it is really an invented legend. It's an invented tradition. There is a legend that says that when Zoroaster was born, he was born smiling or laughing. There's another legend that says a bunch of cows walked over the plain and he was out there as a little baby and they left him. He was left intact. He was not harmed. But clearly these are stories that were created much later to big him up, if you like.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Emil.
I will ask a question on behalf of Alexandra. She says, as I understand, many traditions are re-examining their teachings in light of environmental challenges today. How do you see Zoroastrian teachings influencing or contributing to global conversations about ecology and environmental responsibility, especially ideas about sacredness of the natural elements and the responsibility to protect creation?
Well, I love that question because this is exactly why I got into the environmental movement. And as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, I was involved in the early Green movement. Well, it wasn't early Green movement because, in fact, when I was standing as a parliamentary candidate for the Green Party in the form that it was back in 1992, not the form that we have today, nobody really was talking very much about the environment. But I was brought up by my father talking about the importance of water and how we must respect it and not pollute it. And we didn't, we had new rivers and canals that were very closely managed that brought snow water in underground canals that were underground so they wouldn't evaporate. People had very good understanding, and all through the history of our text, there are lots and lots of references to the importance of cultivating the land in a special way. When people get married, part of our wedding ritual and is to encourage young couples to water lands that are desertified and desertification, trying to bring them back into agriculture and growth, and to also drain marshland. And it is incumbent upon us when we have a baby to plant a tree in honor of that baby, a tree that will be useful to mankind, a tree that will give forth fruit or nuts. And we do that. And when people die, we also plant trees in honor of the people who've died, and they're evergreens. So they'll go on and on well after the time of their children and their children's children. So tree planting, very much an ancient tradition. And of course, you know, the tree of life, the cypress, and the cypress turned into the pattern of paisley. So paisley is botte, and the botte, this paisley shape of a cypress tree with a little bent top, is an ancient tradition. You find it illustrating some of our Zoroastrian sacred texts. So trees were very important. And on our Zoroastrian table for spring, New Year, we put, and if you want to show that picture again, Emma, I don't know if you're able to put that back on, but we put the things that show the outcome of the combination of earth, fire, the sun or the light, water, and air. So we have all the beautiful and pleasure-giving things that nature has given to us to remind us that this harmony of all the elements is a very, very fundamental part of the reverence that we show towards nature. We do not pollute, we cultivate, we bring together. And Zoroastrians were used for the development of gardens by the kings of Iran. In the Safavid period, they developed Isfahan's gardens, and in the Qajar period, the kings brought them specifically Zoroastrian farmers to try and to make the most beautiful gardens for them, and they did in Tehran. So that's actually recorded. That's on kind of public record in documents. So there is an enormous tradition, and there are many other texts that talk about the farming, and of course we have the Greek Cyropedia by Xenophon. Xenophon was a Greek writer who wrote at the end of the 5th century and into the 4th century BC. He was a mercenary, and he served in the army of the would-be usurper king, or the challenging brother to Darius III. And he led an army, or he was with the army. So he got to know the Iranians very well at the time. He was in Cyrus, this guy Cyrus, not the big Cyrus of the cylinder, but another later Cyrus, who wanted to challenge his brother's right to the throne around 401 at the Battle of Cunaxa. So that's a dating period. But he wrote this hagiography of Cyrus. And he wrote about his love of gardens and his cultivation of plants. And it was a truly insightful account of how the Persians loved their gardens and loved cultivating and loved running water and knew how to make beautiful things happen even in deserts. And so on our Persian New Year table, we have things like water. We have on our table shoots that come from wheat or of lentils that show the growth of new life in spring. Then we have things like sweets, white sweets that sugar comes from obviously plants, and this is one of the joys of life, to have sweet things. We have wine on our table because wine is like a disinfectant, and it is also used to be joyful, to be inspired for dancing and poetry and music. We also have beautiful scented flowers that give us such pleasure. We have rose water that we greet people with when they come to our homes. We have fruit, because that is one of the joys of life as well, and it sustains us. We have bread, because that's what comes from the shoots of the wheat. We have cheese and milk, because they come from the animals that eat the grass, and the grass is growing because of the combination of the earth, the fire, and the water that makes all this happen. So it's a very, very, and then we have herbs that are medicinal. They represent the medicinal side of life, herbs and berries. So it is a really very comprehensive table of beauty and pleasure that we derive because we humans have developed the skills to bring together the elements of nature that need to be revered and respected and worked in a proper, practical and constructive way to help us enjoy life more. But it needs respect all the way through. And it's a very, very ancient tradition. So I have always felt very delighted by our spring coming, and Nowruz is such an important festival in our tradition, and it's come right through despite many attempts to suppress it by authorities who felt that it was too close to an ancient past that they perhaps preferred to forget about. It's still there, and we are still celebrating Nowruz, although, as I said, this year there is very little to celebrate except the fact that there is hope for a fresh new start. And let us hope that there will be something positive to celebrate later. So the environmental aspect is a very, very important and deeply rooted and deeply seated part. And many of our festivals are connected with those aspects of nature. As I said, we have the water festival, the fire festival, the spring the spring equinox, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. And the water festival usually arrives around the time of the summer solstice.
Thank you. We've got time just for two more questions, and we have just two more questions, so that's good. I find it rather amusing that you said that Nowruz persists. In fact, it flourishes. There are, according to The Economist, over 300 million people who regularly observe Nowruz, which actually includes the Persian Shiites, the Baha'is, the people of Kurdistan, whichever country they're in, Afghanistan. It's probably your most successful export now, I think.
Well, interestingly, you has recognized Nowruz as a invisible world heritage, and they've also recognized our fire festival, Jashin Sadeh, which the Tajiks were the first to try and register with UNESCO, and only quite recently. So it's true that the countries that you've mentioned, Stephen, and I added to, are part of the Iranian cultural world back in the days of the Achaemenids. I mean, many of you may or may not know this ancient history, but the Iranian Empire that clearly exported some of its cultural ideas and some of its philosophical ideas and its value system stretched from the Aegean Sea, which is, Greece. They came to Marathon. They didn't get Marathon, but they got the northern part of Thessaly. So they had the Greek world right through to India. So that is the swathe of territory which ended up having a very strong Iranian cultural input. And even in India until the 19th century, Persian was the language of the court, and poetry, and the Mughals were very heavily influenced by Persian culture. So it's certainly true that many of the these cultural influences were rooted deeply and for a very long time. But there have been waves of people who are hostile to these ideas, and they have tried to obliterate them.
Yes, indeed. Sean.
Thank you. Hi, Shahin. Thank you for your talk. I've got a quick question about restrictions, because in most religions there's restrictions such as not eating pork, no drinking, even fasting. I was wondering, if any, is there any restrictions in Zoroastrians' beliefs?
We were taught to use our rational minds and work out why, if there were restrictions, why they might be. And if the conditions didn't apply to you, then they shouldn't be restrictions. I mentioned menstruation, for example. It's not a food restriction, but it was a restriction about where women could and couldn't go, and when they could and couldn't go out, for example. But there were very practical reasons why those restrictions existed. And since there are no longer any reasons why those restrictions should be imposed, I think many women actually don't observe them, and it doesn't really matter because it's nobody's business. In terms of food restrictions, no. We drink wine, we eat pork, but everything in moderation. I don't suppose pigs were very widespread in Iran. I don't know, but they were wild boar, no doubt. And as long as people realize that if you leave meat out for very long, it can go off, whether it's pork or whether it's something. There were. Now, I mentioned that there were no restrictions because I'm going back, but there was nothing that told us in the Gathas dogmatically you must or must not do this. But as I mentioned, and I don't know if you were with us when I mentioned that, many things were developed and invented at later stages, because as many religions, you go through different places, different stages, different mind processes, and different geographical conditions. And at some point, there may have been restrictions on food, but I am not aware of anybody who restricts their intake at all. There was no vegetarianism. We had 4 days of the month where we would not cut an animal. It was called nabor. No body done. And nabor meant that you would not eat meat. And the Persian calendar, the Zoroastrian calendar, has got 30 different names for each day of the month. So we have 12 months of 30 days, and then 5 extra days towards the new year where we do the spring cleaning and think of the dead, and they're called intercalary days, and they have their special names. But in each month there are 4 days when we do not eat meat. People would not eat meat, and it is actually in the month of Bahman or Vuhumana. And the month of Vuhumana is the month of animals. So some people would not eat meat at all in that month if they wanted to be very pious, and they would give their animals on those special days when we don't eat meat on the 4 days. And in that month of Bahman or Vuhumana, we would perhaps cosset those animals, not put such heavy loads on the donkeys, give them a rest, give extra portions of alfalfa or grass to our favorite animals and sheep. Some people made a point of being particularly kind to animals in that month, but there was no restriction on eating meat. But we did not eat meat a lot. Meat eating was pretty rare because animals were the source of wool and of milk. And if you want to have your milk and make your yogurt and make your cheese and make your butter, then you don't kill an animal. And also having babies, you don't want to kill your animals. So eating meat was a rare treat, and it was not very frequent. But at Mergan, which is the end of a harvest, when people had worked really hard, that was a time when people did eat meat. And it was a special festival. It was a look forward to festival because people rarely ate meat. It was a real special treat. But even so, those 4 days were specifically non-meat eating days.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Ladwa.
Sorry, it's just Dilip Ladwa, I'm afraid. It's by initials that are DR. Hi. Hey, Shahin. Phenomenal. I think your brilliant explanation of the faith, the religion. Thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. A couple of things you mentioned. I mean, obviously, the Parsis are well established in Gujarat in India, and I think they came in with the view of not segregating themselves, which I think was something that was probably a condition that was applied to them, but they've adopted it. So I noticed you mentioned Sanskrit as a language that was being used in certain references. Is that because Parsis effectively ended up in India?
Yeah.
And some of the themes that you speak about are very similar to other faiths as well. I mean, I noticed that Mike Stigl also mentions that from the pagan tradition, and there are many similarities. I don't know whether there was a cross-pollination of ideas or developed in parallel.
Right. Well, let me first clarify the Sanskrit. Sanskrit was not used as a holy language or textual language for the Zoroastrians. I was Sanskrit in context of how Anquetil du Perron in the 18th century and nowadays academic Indo-European philologists track what the Gartic language is and what it means and how meaning can be ascribed to the words that they come across in Gartic by reference to Vedic Sanskrit, because they were very closely aligned in terms of the historical division. When the Indo-European peoples came to India and Iran, they were part of a similar, the same, if you like, migratory group that are thought to come from the steppes of Central Asia. And at one point or other, they had the same language. When they split geographically, then their languages gradually evolved. I mean, look at Russian and Serbo-Croatian. I happen to know Russian, I happen to know Serbo-Croatian. When you separate space, the languages change. The word we have today for milk, M-L-K, milk, in Russian is malako. So you've got the MLK, and in Serbian it's mleko, MLK still being the operative sounds. So you've got certain things about, certain things that are connected with Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, and the Gartic language. And this is how they cracked the code of what it came to mean. But it didn't say that they were using Sanskrit in any shape or form during Zoroastrian times, no. So that's the Sanskrit part of it. And the pollination part on the pagan part, well, I mentioned that we know that Zoroaster himself came from a family of priests who at the time did not know Zoroaster's message. They were operating according to their own belief systems. We don't. We just happen to have references to them being demon worshippers. As if that was a very negative thing, because they were people who abused other people's superstitions and fears, and they exploited their fears to get benefit for themselves. But I think that it's absolutely obvious that fire was the adoration or the importance attributed to fire is nothing to do with exclusively Zoroastrianism or Zoroaster. He saw fire as a symbolic representation of truth, of clarity, of illumination, of light in your head, and going on the right path towards that enlightened way of being. The fire was, on the one hand, a symbolic function, but on the other hand, we all know that we all need fire. And the temples in Zoroastrianism are called the House of Fire, Atesh Kadeh. And it is probable that Atesh Kadeh were important places where if you didn't have matches and you didn't have flint to hand very easily, and you didn't want to spend forever trying to create a fire, you'd have a depository in every community, a firehouse, where you would be able to get some fire from there and bring back your used embers and put them back in the depository so that other people could use fire. The fire would be eternally available to a community. And it came to represent later, with Zoroastrianism, the symbolic purity of mind, purity of illumined thought. So it combined the functional use of the fire and the symbolic purpose of fire as well. I cannot claim any, no one could claim that fire and the understanding for the importance of fire is Zoroaster. And similarly, all the festivals I've mentioned, the importance of water and fire and the spring and all these things, well, of course, other people would have recognized that too. In Britain, we have Stonehenge, we have the Druids going there. It's clear that the sun is a very, very important part of our existence. But in Zoroastrianism, it kind of became a very kind of what can I say, prominent and absolutely primal symbol of the energy of life, the energy of existence, enlightenment, and all those things.
Well, thank you very much.
I would like to thank you, Shahin, very, very much for a really fascinating talk, which was wonderful. And I just would like to add to everybody here at the moment that Shahin has a lot of talented musicians who are Zoroastrians who frequently perform either in London or here at the Holy Well Music Rooms in Oxford or somewhere like that. And it's well worth going to one of these things. So if you provide us with your email, if you'd like Shahin to get invitations sent out for you, we can do that.
Well, that's a very nice idea. I'll have to tempt Payman back up. He's a wonderful sand tourist, and he brings with him a whole band of people from different backgrounds, always Afghans, Kurds, Azaris, people who come from this cultural plateau of Iranian culture, who make wonderful music, if you like that sort of sound, which I love. So I'd be happy to let you know when he's next coming, when I hear that he's next coming.
Thank you. For ourselves, for the Southeast England Faith Forum, we have had a series of excellent lectures, of which this is only the latest. And we feel that it's doing something to help people of goodwill of different faiths understand each other better. So what we would really appreciate is if you would provide us with your email so that we can send you invitations to subsequent lectures. And we're very happy for you to send it on to other people as